That's good.
Hello. Okay, so today we're doing Libra. So a few weeks ago, we did Venus, and we're not going to go Venus through the houses. What I'm going to speak to is more about the levels of consciousness, the myth, and how to use the Venus at a higher vibration. So it'll be a little bit more esoteric nature of a class, but of course, we'll look at the charts, and if you have specific questions about your Venus, we can do that. So the myth that I covered back in the Taurus, I spoke to you about the birth of Aphrodite, right? So Uranus was castrated by Saturn and Venus emerged from the sperm of the oceans, right? So it's like that famous painting from Botticelli, and you brought that beautiful clip art that's in our slides. There's many, many, many myths around Venus, okay? And I'm going to bring up in a minute the levels of consciousness sheet that's in your astrology basics so that we could start comparing a little. So here we're looking at two primary myths. One is the myth of Cupid. Okay, so we always see Cupid like with the bow and arrow and the blindfold, and we say the words love is blind. So that is the Venus Libra, or the Libra Venus versus the Taurus Libra or Taurus Venus. So we have Aphrodite has a child with Mercury. So we've got Venus, which is delusion and veils and beauty and all of the smells and the passions and the second chakras and all of this sort of enamorment. And that is one of the words for Libra. They love to be adored. They love to be, you know, just beautified and enamored and gifted and things like that. And she's having a child with Mercury, who is illusion, low-level consciousness, delusion. And their child, Cupid, represents Valentine's Day, right? Love is blind. That's why women go crazy and what did you get me or what didn't you get me? And the guys has to go to run to get to the jewelry store. And did I get it right? Didn't I get it right? That's the myth that we're dealing with at a low vibration. And we're going to do both. So we have to remember that love is blind, that love is entering through the senses when we're talking about Venus, wherever it is in the chart, but specifically Libra by cusp and by decanat. And we all have something. Generationally, well, Abby is a Libra sun, and you and I generationally have Pluto and Uranus in Libra. So even though I don't have any specific planets and you don't have any specific planets other than the generational ones, I'm talking about personal planets, there's going to be either a generational planet, there's going to be a cusp, or there's going to be a decanat where this is true, okay? So that's one of the myths we want to focus on. Another myth that we want to focus on has to do with a beauty fight that was happening between the goddesses Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera. So in the Snow White story, when the Wicked Witch goes to the mirror and says, who is the fairest of them all? That comes from this Greek myth. Hera promises the gentleman, there was a gentleman in the woods who had never seen a naked woman before. So that comes to play in a moment. And they ask him to do the beauty contest. Hera offers him riches. Athena offers him skills at war. And Aphrodite opens up her trench coat and shows her beautiful figure. And he obviously chose Aphrodite. So this ability to seduce, and it's a different seduction than Lilith that we're going to cover next week. The ability to soothe with the feminine, the ability to seduce with a look, with a smell, with a texture, with something that you wear. That is all the domain of Venus and Libra Venus. Okay, that's the beauty that we're talking about. So anyway, Aphrodite wins, and she's deemed the fairest of them all. Aphrodite also is the reason that the Trojan War was started. So when we start thinking about desires, when we start thinking about beauty, Helen of Troy was deemed the most beautiful woman in the world. Why? And the fight was about her, was because she wore Aphrodite's chastity belt. So there's always a link to sex, to passion, to the second chakra, not in a Taurus way of I have. And the words of Libra are I balance. And I'll get to that in a minute through the glyph and what we're here to learn from it from a consciousness level. So it all has to do with the seducing, the femininity, the beauty, the smell, the textiles, the textures. In some way, that part of your chart has that energy to it. So even if you're the most, non-romantic or non-beauty oriented or non-anything to do with perfumes or makeups, or you have that essence somewhere in your chart. At a practical level, this is the kind of woman that a man likes by sign. Just on that note, like we did Aries or Mars in a woman's chart. So that's sort of like the vibe that the Libra Venus has versus the Taurus. The Taurus is more about the money, the I have, the possessions, the gold. So I'm just going to share a moment the levels of consciousness worksheet. So we can look at the Libra versus the Taurus, okay? So Venus is the planet that when we kind of start to evolve our consciousness, the higher levels of our Venus in our chart is what eventually we want to show up as in the world. But first we have to understand why it's so important in terms of low level consciousness. So low level consciousness has to do with this idea that we're desirous, that our senses are used to harm rather than to connect to the grace of the divine, right? When we talk about the senses, at a heightened sense of intuition, we're talking about the clairs, clairvoyance, claircognizance, clairalience, clairgustance, claircognizance. If we do not evolve and wake up and raise our consciousness as human beings, we live out the Venus in our chart at a very low level desirous nature. And so looking at the consciousness levels is important. When eventually we're sort of done with our hero's journey or we've unmasked ourselves, and we're going to talk more about the sins and the masks and the seduction of a Lilith next week, which is a little different than the Venus seducing. It's about desires. It's about using our senses to self-destruct. So in the myth of Taurus, of the Cretan bull, Hercules has to ride the Cretan bull and take the bull out of Crete and bring it to the temple. What we learn with Taurus Venus, and I'm talking about a lower level consciousness, is that we must learn to ride our desires. So whether it's gluttony or greed or envy or pride or deceit or attachment, and we're going to talk about those in a minute with your sign of Libra. The goal is that we don't negate our desires. Nothing in this myth, nothing says negate your desires. On the contrary, own that you have these desires. All that Libra and Venus is about desires. But we have to get to a point where rather than I have in Taurus, I balance. And you'll see that in the glyph and in the myth. So here we're talking about the golden calf, which comes from when the Jews leave Egypt and they make the golden calf that they pray to in the desert. The bull, of course, always represents low level consciousness, and the desires sort of override us. This is when we're in full embracing of our lowest nature, call it hedonism, call it pleasure seeking, even pain as pleasure or pleasure as pain, because it goes both ways. We're full blown on desires run our life. Then as we raise consciousness, the Minotaur, which comes from the myths in your lecture, he rides the bull that's in the Cretan bull, and we start to balance our desires. We recognize that we have desires and we give into, but we're trying to find something more than ourselves, the divine, that we can actually honor, this would be the clairs, our intuition, our divinity, our grace, our spiritual life. Okay. And then the bullfighter is that now you're in charge of your desires. Your desires don't ride you, but rather you're negotiating with your body and your senses. That's the Taurus I have. The Libra Venus is the earthworm, the caterpillar, the chrysalis, and the butterfly. The Libra Venus is the one that makes us whole. It is through this Venus that we understand that we are all that we are ridden by our desires like others. We are just like them. But it's through those desires that we use our senses for grace, to channel divine, to use the graces and the muses, which are children of Aphrodite. So you hear a higher vibration, music, a sound healing. You look at art that's beautifying versus something that's harsher to your senses. And we learn to use our senses to birth beauty rather than to self-destruct. And through that is the elevation of our senses through our clairs. So we become more intuitive as we tap into this nature, and it's all rooted in balance. The irony of Libra, it's the least balanced sign in your chart. By planet, by cusp, by decanat. We have to work very, very, very hard, and you'll see the glyph is sort of like the middle way or the Tao or the passage upon which we achieve balance. Now, last week, we talked about Virgo and Chiron. It is only through our human nature, through our commonness, and through a catastrophe, and I'll refer back to the myth in a second, that we can get to this Libra of balance. So in the myth of Hercules associated with Virgo, it is the girdle of Aphrodite that Hippolyte has. Hercules forces himself onto Hippolyte and takes it from her and kills her. That is the catastrophe of being human, the catastrophe of a death, the catastrophe of a divorce, the catastrophe of an illness, whatever makes you human that causes the suffering and the pain, the abandonment, the rejection we covered last week. That is what we are looking at. And I don't know if I pressed record. Yikes. Yes, I did. Okay. So we have to have that precursor of that myth of how Hercules killed Hippolyte and had such remorse in order to get to this understanding of balance. So I have a statue here of Themis. This is the goddess Themis, and she's blind and she has the scales of justice. Libra is the only sign that has a symbol like the scales. Gemini is the twins and its people, and Virgo is wheat that represents Demeter or the grain. But the symbol is the scales for Libra, and it's the only zodiac sign that has a symbol as its icon. And it relates to balance, to the scales of justice, light, dark, human, divine, good, bad. And it's midpoint of the zodiac for this reason. So as a result of Hercules killing Hippolyte, he goes and he saves Hesione. He tries to rectify and purify and cleanse himself of his bad actions. Then he is given the Eurythmian boar labor. And the Eurythmian boar labor has two major components that relates to this sign in our chart and where we have Venus, specifically Libra. When the master tells Hercules, go capture the Eurythmian boar, he says, take time to eat. It is the only myth of all of the labors, and remember, we are Hercules. This represents our spiritual journey, and our map is our chart. It's the only labor that Hercules is told, take time to eat. Eat means pleasures of the flesh. So if we try to negate our flesh, our desires, our passions, we're not in balance. So just because people are not hedonists, right? And everything isn't about pleasure. If everything is about pain and suffering, oh my God, I killed Hippolyte, I better purify, blah, blah, does not make us any more balanced, any more whole, any more spiritual. And that's the importance of this myth. And this Themis is the goddess of justice, order, peace, good timing, good judgment. And the key to Libra is not to deny the pleasures of the flesh, not to deny the senses, not to not indulge in beauty and smells and textiles and sex and showing off your body, but rather good order, good decision making. The justice of, is this a good time to engage in that? Is there something better I could be doing with my senses? This is a time for the graces and the muses and a divinity, a better use of my senses, or just pleasure, 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 or just pain, pain, pain. So we have to look at the zodiac and the labors as a story that's unfolding. But we enter Libra with a labor from Hercules where he self-flagellated, he purified, he punished because he failed to listen. And if you keep yourself rejected, in exile, abandoned, that's just as bad as if you're like, screw it, let me give in to every desire. So that's where we start to see the balancing of the desires from the Cretan bull, that he rides the bull of desires, you can't not give in, to now your good judgment. But the master says, take time to eat. Now, he doesn't do such a good job. This is really important because he passes the labor, but he doesn't pass this labor with flying colors, with applause. He barely makes it. We don't need to win life at 100. We barely need to get this lesson in order to be okay. So he goes to get the Erythmian boar, and he runs into his friend Pholos. Pholos is a centaur. Remember, other than Chiron, all centaurs are drunks and rapists. So he encounters his lower nature. He encounters his party, pleasure-seeking, desirous nature. And Pholos has a bottle of wine. The bottle of wine was supposed to be shared amongst the other friends. No one was there. Pholos said, screw it. Hercules said, screw it. And they drank the entire bottle of wine. They drank all night. They ate all night. They partied all night. And when he was going to bed, he's like, oh, shoot, I need to catch the boar. And he takes out like this, like a mouse trap. He sets it by the mountainside. The trap catches the boar. He wakes up the next morning. The boar's in the trap. And he walks downstairs. No effort whatsoever. And he holds the back feet of the boar as he walks down the mountain. The second thing, that's the only time this happens in a labor, everybody is laughing. This is the only time in Hercules' labors that ends in laughter and starts with pleasures of the flesh. We need to laugh at ourselves. Sometimes we need to be lazy. Sometimes we need to take it easy. Sometimes we need to find a shortcut. And when we get full circle in the spiritual adulting map with all of the archetypes, after you've reached the top of the ladder of all of the archetypes, and we'll talk more about that next week with the deadly sins and Lilith and the seductressness of Lilith as Scorpio and the shadow and the Hydra and all of that, you've got to go right back into the world, and you've got to laugh a little, and you've got to drink a little, and you've got to play a little. because this life is not about not doing those things. It's about having the judgment how often and how and when that doesn't own you when you do it, that your desires and your senses are not used to self-destruct, but rather for you to laugh and find camaraderie and have some friends. So this labor is super, super important. Libra is a very lazy sign. Libra likes, it's the quintessential woman that's taken care of. Our generation, Jennifer, is Uranus and Pluto in Libra. It is a height of renegotiating marital rules because they're generational planets. So our generation, sort of the height of divorce and doing it differently, and the beginning of what then came for the next generations of Pluto in Scorpio and Pluto and Sag, according to sex and desires and girl bossing and slut shaming and all that stuff. It started with our generation with Pluto and Uranus in Libra. These things started to sort of collapse because Uranus is chaos and Pluto is destruction. So the family values or this vision of marriage or what it should look like based on the Libra kept woman started to really unravel during that generational time. So I think you were mentioning the other day that that video series that was popular a few months back, the Changing of the Gods. So when you start to see Uranus and Pluto, and we happen to have both of those, our generation, in the same sign, Libra being the sign of marriage. And I'll talk about that in a minute for a sacrament from the Christian perspective and why that's the sign of marriage in a minute. But the destruction and the chaos of the marriage started with the unraveling there with our generation that led way to Pluto and Sag and so forth, because those are all going to be generational planets. If you look at the speed of the planets, you see Pluto is about every 12 to 24 years changes sign, and Uranus every 7 years changes sign. So you start to see why generationally they represent different things. So in our case, this was one of those things that said, no, we're doing it different. But by nature, Libra rules the seventh, the marriage. Now, on the cusp of your seventh, whether it's Libra or not, doesn't matter. That is a secret language that you inherited from your parents based on marriage, on what marriage should be. Now, whether you do it or you don't do it, or you fight with that aspect of yourself, is a personal story. But that is something, whether the parents were a one-night stand, they knew each other, they were married, they weren't married, doesn't matter. Subconsciously, you inherited that seventh house cusp, which is the marriage cusp, the relationship cusp on this. It's marriage. This is what we deem to be the way that relationships work. So that's one aspect that's hidden in the charts, like a secret sort of language. I have The Truth is in the Triangle book. I have a whole section on that with all of the language per sign. Okay. Now, the seventh house is the way that you allow others in. But the seventh house cusp, and next week we're going to talk about the eighth house cusp as a shadow aspect. The seventh house cusp is how you marry your shadow self, how your light self and your dark self reconcile in you. The concept of the sacrament of marriage in Christianity comes from a concept called the Hieros Gamos. The Hieros Gamos is called the mystical marriage. It actually comes from alchemy. And so the alchemy, the vision or the visual, is this vase, and it has the sun as light and the moon as dark inside the bottom of the vase. If I show it to you, you've seen it. It's a pretty famous image, metaphysical image. And what it's saying is the mystical marriage comes when you marry your light and your dark, your good and your bad, your spiritual and your material. So this desirous nature cannot be eliminated, rather integrated. And when you learn to live with both aspects of yourself, you learn to laugh at yourself. You learn to enjoy life a little bit. You seek happiness and pleasure and contentment and eudaimonia through knowing that you're light and you're dark. So it takes away this pressure, and that's why it's a little lazy. It's a lazy sign just by nature. It's just lazy, but it is the part of us that's a little bit even spiritually lazy, because we're kind of okay that we can give in to some of our desires, that we could just call in and phone it in some days. This is the aspect of self that we start to become friendly with. That's why we can laugh. That's also going to be, and I'll show you that in the chart with the sign, the aspects of others that you can most tolerate once and only once you understand that that's the part of you that you most hate. So the sign of your Venus also has to do with the deadliest sin that you may dislike in another. And once you learn to laugh at it and embrace it and understand it, actually becomes the lens in which you love another. So we'll go through those in a bit. Any questions so far? Because this is more esoteric than astrologic, but it gives the understanding of why. So from an archetype perspective, the lover, this is the lover archetype. There's two types of lovers. Okay, there's two Venuses. It's the only one that has two. Taurus Venus, Libra Venus. Taurus is the lover of things, of the material, where Libra is the lover of people and others, because I understand that they are materially and desirous and human. So in the archetype chart, there's two Venuses. And the way back home to self is through your Venus. That is going to be the love language for you. That's your fourth chakra. That is the agape love. So the Greeks have 7 types of loves. They collapse down to 3. I talked about these last time. Eros love, second chakra. I desire sex, things, money, XYZ. Self-love that can only come, and that's this, can only come when I understand that I have a desirous low-level nature, and I have nature. We saw that with Virgo, right? Being human in common. But if we hate ourselves for being human in common and expecting that we're never going to give in to our desires, we cannot have self-love. And thereby, once we laugh at ourselves, overdrink, overeat, recognize our laziness, both human and spiritually, then the Libra Venus opens up the heart for agape love. Love thy neighbor because you've learned to love thyself. So the Virgo and Libra classes piggyback on one another. Any questions so far? Okay, so I'm going to bring a visual to teach you something. So these are the Matryoshka dolls, right? The Taurus Libra is I have, right? I have a great body. I have an ego. I've got a lot of money. I've got brains. It's what you have, second house, that gives you worth. When Virgo shows you that you're human, when Virgo keeps you in exile and rejected in the myth, when he kills Hippolyte, and he's like, oh my God, what did I do? The catastrophe usually is linked to what you have that makes you think you are of worth. So many people are taken from them in order to get to this level of self-love and then loving another. They lose that exact thing that they think gives them worth. So they lose the job, they lose the wealth, they lose the body, they lose the intelligence, whatever, the corner office, whatever it is. That is why it's usually a catastrophe that leads to the heroskamos, the mystical marriage, the marriage of self, the light, dark, the good, bad, justice, and we call it divine justice. Oh, God is punishing me. People love to say that. No, we humans, create our own crisis through Virgo so that divine justice is served so that we can figure out the low-level consciousness of Libra, which is an earthworm. You are an earthworm. You'll get squashed. You'll get squished. You are nothing. You are no one without all the things that you give worth to. And it's never the divinity. It's I'm a good person, or I have this, or I have that, or I'm a good mother, or I'm a bad that, because bad too. People do that too. And so through that catastrophe in Virgo, we come to realize that we are just an earthworm. Splat, squash, nothingness. Low-level consciousness. Next is the caterpillar. The caterpillar, the chrysalis, and the butterfly obviously represent a transformation process, not transmutation. We are not there yet, but it is the beginning of a transformation process. I am not what I have. I am not the label. I am not XYZ. So the caterpillar emerges, enters the chrysalis, which is done in private. This is why most people go through some dark night of the soul, even though the dark night of the soul is for Scorpio. And we'll see Pluto and Black Moon. We'll probably do back-to-back weeks on Scorpio, one for Black Moon and one for Pluto. You don't enter that until you get to this phase. How much more of XYZ do I need to not be happy? How many more lovers? How much more food? How much more sex? How much more money? How much more vacation? How much more? So we create our own catastrophe to lose whatever that is giving us value so that we can begin the I balance process, which is the next 6 signs. The symbol for Libra is the scales. If you look at it here, it's the Tao, it's the way. There's a little space. It's to keep you, what I call the 48 to 52, right? The midpoint. Walking through the light and the dark, the good and the bad, the spirit and the matter. That's why the glyph is like this of the scales. If you walk that fine line, you're not going to take away from anything. You're going to indulge in senses, but with good decision making. You're going to know when it's time to laugh. You're going to know when you can be slothful, and then when you have to get to hard work. And I'm talking about your spirit. You honor the divine, you honor the material. That's the true Heroskamos with self. This is just the beginning of the transformation process. So the chrysalis is usually associated with that inner work. Why did this happen? What is this trying to teach me? Depending obviously on what your belief system is, but why did I create this? And then when you come out of the chrysalis in your sort of heightened sense of awareness or your transformation, that these things might matter, but they are not the end all be all any longer. Your divinity matters, your soul matters, you empty with nothing matter. That's when we can continue on the spiritual journey. That this is a stopping point. Any questions about this? Make sense? So I'm going to give you a little nugget that I put in my book. Truth is in the Triangle, just from a relationship standpoint, because everybody loves relationships. This is the cusp of the 7th. It rules marriage, closest friends, and of course, your mystical marriage with self. It's the aspect of self that you want to integrate. So you can look at this from the 7th house cusp and as well the Venus, which is what allows you to kind of love others. Remember, Eros, self-love, agape love. So the ultimate goal of understanding your desirous nature is not just self-love. It's giving back its compassion and grace to another once you've understood your own darkness. So that's the end-all goal of the spiritual journey. That's going to be found in the Venus by sign and by decanat. So if you want to love others, you can't start with the Venus and the sign and the decanat, but you can practice if you want. But really, it's the thing in yourself you need to accept. The cusp of the 7th is the inherited language you got from your parents subconsciously for your relationships. This is when the decanats come into play. This is my theory. I was gifted this theory in my guidance. You do not find this in any other book. It's in my book. You don't have to believe it. This is what I see and I use in practice. The cusp of the 7th by decanat here is, in this person's case, Nicole's, Pisces with the Pluto decanat. So it might be very destructive. It might be very wealth oriented. The person, you're going to have the conversation, obviously, with yourself or your client to see how they're living that out. The family. Okay. The goal for us to get to a place of not only loving our desirous nature, ourselves and others, particularly our romantic partner, because at the end of the day, Libra is about romance and sex and marriage, is the decanat up. In this case, it's Aries. So it could be sharing the power or who has what power, having those conversations. Again, each person's going to be holistic in the chart, but it's the one decanat. So we can look at other charts. Any questions on that? So Abby, yours is Uranus. So chaos, freedom, uprootedness, let's say, originality, right? That's going to be something that you inherit from your parents' marriage. For you to make your relationships work, you take it up the next decanat. It's going to be the moon, roots, home, traditions, family, for instance. And depending on what you're struggling with your partner, you would see how that works. And because it's the next decanat up, this is not going to be your default. That is where the transformation comes in. So you'll probably have to experience the chrysalis through a Uranus lens in relationships before you can establish this one. This isn't easy, is my point. Because it's not about the other, it's about the aspect of yourself that you haven't yet integrated. You have your Hieros Gamos with self, obviously the relationship will reflect that, depending on where you are in the stage of relationship. Questions? So Jen, Pluto, Cancer, the Pluto decanat. So it could have been power struggles, destruction, death, financial success, all the good, bad, ugly that Pluto represents. And Neptune would be the decanat to work towards. Now, every single planet has high consciousness, low consciousness, right? So you would go to your consciousness worksheet, and at the low consciousness, it's a piranha or delusion. And we're going to talk about the sins in a minute as a precursor for next week. But this could be a spiritual understanding. This could be a level of compassion rather than an escapism or a delusion. And again, this isn't easy to get to that decanat. It is just for transformation, but it's a game changer because it's about ourselves. It's not about the partner. So if you're not in relationship, this is another way you can use that you have to give yourself that. And then that responds in the mirroring of the relationship. Anybody else on? My dear mom, she said she might join. So here is a Taurus in the Mercury. So it could have been intellect, it could have been deceit, it could have been logical, rational. And it's right on the cusp here. So it could have been, I'd have to check. Actually, it might be Saturn. I don't think it's Mercury. Okay, so it's at 19 degrees. So I couldn't see with my eye if it was the second decanat or the first or the third, I'm sorry. And it's the Saturn decanat. So now we're talking about Saturn. So here, rigidity, inflexibility, ambition, structure, limits, that kind of thing. And the way to rise it would be with more Mercury, either more communication. Of course, at the low consciousness, there can be deceit, but more of having an illusion or living more in the world with understanding and comprehension and communication versus the rigidity. So remember, even though it's the seventh cusp of relationship and others, this is about the heroskamos with yourself, alchemically, how to get that with you. So now, any questions about that before I go to the Venus signs? Okay. So because we are all programmed in some collective unconscious way that our desires are bad, we are one of an extreme, trying to suppress desires, more of a pain as pleasure, or giving into our desires, hedonism, pleasure as pain. Either excess, either extreme represents the Venus and represents how you self-destruct through your desires. So whatever the sign is, and I'll go through some of the highlights, will indicate where that particular desire you do on overdrive or pretend to not do because you want to suppress that desire. And then you realize that you are this despite having the desires around you. Okay. So Aries tends to have wrath, Taurus, greed and attachment, Gemini, deceit and betrayal, Cancer, attachment, hoarding, kind of like Taurus, Leo, pride, Virgo is like a perfection, uber criticism, judgmental nature, but not wanting to own the humanness of it. Libra, lust and sloth. Scorpio, lust and control. Sagittarius, escapism and gluttony. Capricorn, greed. Aquarius, deceit and pride. It could also be extreme logic and rational, like I'm so different, I cannot be like a commoner. So Virgo and Aquarius have a similar energy. And Pisces, delusions and escapism. That's at the low level consciousness, what it is that you're trying to not be or hide or self-destruct or hate about yourself. So the reason that we always think of Libra as a sign of the other, and again, I'm talking metaphysically, so whether it's this shadow aspect that makes you whole, the darkness or the other side of the scale to balance, that you have to laugh at, or the sign of the Venus has to do with the other, you either dislike that low consciousness of that sign and the other gives you back, goes back inward. So whether it's the seventh house cusp that needs to be increased by decanat, which is a shift in vibration, or integrating the low level consciousness of your Venus, that creates the other and you. You become whole, you become integrated, you laugh at yourself, you own your low level consciousness, and at the same time, agape love, which I love others because I have recognized that in myself. Questions. And the Venus is the sign that I mentioned, not the sun sign. Any questions? So this is one of those more esoteric-y type of classes. No questions?
No questions.
Does Abby have any questions?
Do you have any questions, Abs? Mm-mm.
Okay. So Themis, being the goddess of good counsel and order, part of this balance and achieving the transformation is when we can get this part of our chart in check. Now, we don't have aspects yet. So in level 2, when we start doing aspects, if you have a square versus a trine versus a conjunct, then you're going to start getting bigger layers of what your particular Venus is doing. But think of it as misuse of the senses. And what the myth of Hercules speaks to is it's not eradicating the senses, but appropriate use of the senses, hopefully with good counsel and good order, because you're checking in with that other side of yourself saying, this may be too much or too little or too lazy or too much pleasure, and having that inner check. Any specific questions about anything or your chart, even if it's not Libra related?
Any questions about your chart?
Okay. Well, love you guys.
Love you.
And I will talk to you probably today. Later. I'll send you the recording in a few.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.